I just faced my own worst nightmare. The HOA president used her master key to stash 2 monster trucks in my grandpa's garage, blocking his woodshop and crushing his classic Mustang. And her excuse? She said she was just borrowing the space. Funny thing is, the only thing borrowed that day was her authority before we shredded it in front of the whole neighborhood. Let me start from the beginning. The first thing I heard was Grandpa's voice. Tight, strained, wrong. This was a man who built his own house, fixed his own cars, and told stories about walking uphill to school both ways. And you believed him. He didn't ask for help. Ever. So when he called and just said, "Ethan," in a whisper, my blood ran cold. Sarah saw my face, set down her coffee, and grabbed the keys without a word. We were in the car in seconds, tires screeching. No sirens, no lights, just trimmed lawns and quiet sprinklers until I saw it. The garage door was wide open. 2 massive, gleaming SUVs sat crammed nose to tail inside like a chrome centipede. Behind them, pinned to the back wall, was Grandpa's '67 candy apple red Mustang. His pride, his project, the only thing he loved as much as Grandma. And beyond that, the locked door to his Wuchafi's refuge. This wasn't parking. This was a hit. My protective instincts, always simmering just below the surface, went from a low boil to a raging inferno in a heartbeat. I felt a heat rise in my chest that had nothing to do with the morning sun. Who did this? I asked, my voice low and dangerous. Sarah was at my side now, her hand on my arm, a silent plea for me to keep my cool. She knew my temper. Walter finally turned his head, his eyes meeting mine. There was a weariness in them that scared me more than anger would have. Her, he said, the word dripping with a quiet, tired venom. Sharon Miller, of course. The queen of our little suburban kingdom. The self-appointed warden of the Westgate Meadows Homeowners Association. I should have known. This had her fingerprints all over it. It was petty. It was vicious. And it was an extreme abuse of power. It was her signature move. She used the HOA master key, Walter explained, his voice flat. Let herself in, drove these things in, and locked up. I came out to get the paper and found this. He took a shaky breath. I slammed the garage door shut on them, and I called the police. Just as he said it, a police cruiser rolled silently up to the curb. A single officer got out, a woman with a calm, no-nonsense look on her face. Her name tag read Ramos. She took in the scene the giant trucks, my fuming grandpa, me looking like I was about to punch a hole in one of those stupidly large tires and didn't even blink. Getting an early start this morning, Walter, she said, a hint of wry humor in her voice. It was clear this wasn't her first call to our neighborhood involving our HOA president. Walter just grunted in response. He started to explain what happened, but was cut short by the screech of tires. A pristine white Lexus SUV came flying around the corner and slammed to a halt in front of Walter's driveway. The driver's door flew open and out stepped Sharon Miller herself. She was exactly as I remembered her from the one HOA meeting I'd been forced to attend. Perfectly styled blonde hair that looked like it would shatter if you touched it, an expensive pantsuit that was probably worth more than my car, and a face locked in a permanent expression of sour disapproval. She looked like she'd been born demanding to speak to a manager. "What is the meaning of this?" she shrieked, pointing a perfectly manicured finger at the closed garage door. "You are illegally detaining my property. Officer, arrest this man." Officer Ramos just sighed, a long-suffering sound. "Ma'am, I'm going to need you to calm down." But Sharon wasn't listening. She stomped up the driveway, right past my grandpa, and started punching numbers into the garage door keypad. It was a stunning display of entitlement. She was trying to break into the man's garage right in front of a cop. "Ma'am, that's his private property," Officer Ramos said, her voice turning firm. "Step away from the keypad." Sharon ignored her, her face twisted in rage as she tried the code again. It was at this moment that the neighborhood finally woke up. Doors started opening. People, drawn by the commotion, started wandering onto their lawns, phones in hand. My neighbor from across the street, a perpetually confused but good-hearted guy named Arthur, shuffled out in his bathrobe, blinking in the sunlight like a sleepy owl. He saw the trucks, saw Sharon, and just shook his head slowly. The audience was growing. Sharon's meltdown was becoming a public spectacle. The keypad beeped angrily, refusing her entry. She'd forgotten that Walter, a man who valued his privacy, had changed the code months ago. In a fit of pure frustration, she actually started punching the garage door with her fists. "That's enough," Ramos said, stepping forward and taking Sharon by the arm. "You're on his property. You've admitted to putting your vehicles in his garage without permission, and you're causing a disturbance." Sharon ripped her arm away. "This man is a menace. He is violating HOA bylaws. My vehicles are collateral for his outstanding fines." She sputtered, inventing a rule on the spot. It was a lie, and everyone knew it. The whispers from the growing crowd of neighbors told me that. Officer Ramos's patience had clearly run out. "Sharon, I'm giving you a ticket for trespassing. Take it, get in your car, and leave. We can sort out the truck situation later." She scribbled on her notepad, tore off the ticket, and held it out. For a second, I thought Sharon might actually explode. Her face went from red to a blotchy purple. She snatched the ticket, crumpled it in her fist, and stalked back to her Lexus, all while half the neighborhood was filming her on their phones. She threw one last hateful glare at my grandpa. It was a look that promised war. As her car sped away, leaving a cloud of dust and rage behind, she roared off alone. The two hulks she'd borrowed stayed jammed inside, still choking the bay like abandoned whales. I looked at Walter. He looked tired, but a little of the fight was back in his eyes. Sarah squeezed my hand. The immediate crisis was over, but I knew with a certainty that chilled me to the bone, this was only the beginning. Sharon Miller had drawn a line in the sand, and we were all on the wrong side of it. I wouldn't let my grandpa fight her alone. This wasn't just about two trucks in a garage anymore. This was about defending our home. Sharon Miller wasn't born evil. I think she just worked her way up to it, like climbing a corporate ladder of nastiness. Before she became the iron-fisted ruler of Westgate Meadows, she was just another resident. She'd moved in about 10 years ago, a divorcee with a fat settlement and a personality that could curdle milk. At first, people felt sorry for her. She was always complaining about something: the noise from the kids playing in the street, the color of someone's welcome mat, the placement of a garden gnome. She saw violations where the rest of us saw life. We all moved to this neighborhood for the same reason. It was supposed to be peaceful, a little slice of quiet suburbia with good schools, a community pool, and enough space between houses that you didn't have to hear your neighbor sneeze. It was the kind of place people dreamed of when they wanted to settle down. Sarah and I bought our house here right after we got married. We wanted a backyard for a dog we hadn't gotten yet, and a safe street for kids we hoped to have one day. For a while, it was perfect. Then came the HOA election. No one ever wanted to be president. It was a thankless job, mostly dealing with budgets for landscaping and planning the annual potluck. So when Sharon volunteered, practically begging for the role, everyone was relieved. We didn't know we were handing the keys to the kingdom to a tyrant in training. Her first year was all about restoring order. She rewrote the bylaws, making them longer, more confusing, and filled with ridiculous rules. My neighbor Arthur got a formal warning because his recycling bin was visible from the street for an hour too long on trash day. The Henderson family had to repaint their entire house because the shade of beige they had used was, according to Sharon's paint sample booklet, too warm for the neighborhood's aesthetic. She walked the streets with a clipboard and a measuring tape, checking grass height and the distance between shrubs. She became a walking, talking violation notice. People grumbled, but no one did anything. It was easier to just pay the small fine or move the garden gnome than to fight her. We were all too busy with our own lives to wage a war over lawn ornaments. My grandpa Walter moved in with us about 3 years ago after my grandmother passed. He sold their big house in the city and used the money to build a small, detached apartment over our garage. It was the perfect setup. He had his independence, and we had him close. He was supposed to be retired, but Walter wasn't the type to sit still. His passion was his garage. He'd installed a professional-grade woodshop in the back half, where he spent hours crafting beautiful furniture, toys for charity, and intricate little birdhouses. The front half was a showroom for his one true love, the '67 Mustang. He'd bought it when he was a young man, sold it when he and my grandma needed money for their first house, and then miraculously found it again 30 years later in a barn, rusted and forgotten. He spent a decade bringing it back to life. Every nut, every bolt was a memory. That car wasn't just a car, it was his history. It was his connection to my grandmother. He'd polished the chrome until it gleamed, and the roar of its engine was the sound of his youth. Sharon hated him from day one. She couldn't stand his independence. He didn't come to the HOA meetings. He didn't care about her perfectly manicured community vision. He was a man from a different era, one where you could work on your own car in your own driveway, without a committee's approval. Their first run-in was over the sound of his table saw. Sharon claimed it violated the noise ordinance, even though he only ever worked between 10 o'clock in the morning and 4 o'clock in the afternoon. She sent him a fine. He sent it back with a note written in his firm, old-fashioned script. See you in court. She backed down. She knew she had no legal leg to stand on, but she never forgave him for it. She saw him as a rebel, a threat to her absolute authority. The war between them was quiet but constant. She'd leave violation notices on his door for oil stains on the driveway, stains that were miraculously gone by the time I came to look. He'd ignore them. She tried to fine him for having a commercial enterprise because he sold a few birdhouses at a local craft fair. He showed her the bylaws she'd written herself, which said nothing of the sort. Each time he won, she just got angrier. Neighbor Arthur became our unofficial source of Sharon-related news. He was retired, too, and his main hobby was observing the neighborhood from his front porch. Saw the dragon lady today, he'd tell me over the fence while I was mowing the lawn. She was measuring the miller's mailbox post. Looked furious. I think it might be a quarter of an inch too tall. He found her ridiculous, but he also saw the damage she was doing. She's sucking the joy out of this place, Ethan, he'd say, shaking his head. People are afraid to put up Christmas lights now, in case they're not the right shade of white. He was right. A cloud of low-grade anxiety had settled over Westgate Meadows. People started avoiding each other, afraid a friendly chat would be interpreted as a conspiracy. The community spirit was dying, choked out by Sharon's endless rules and regulations. So, when I saw those trucks in Walter's garage, I knew it wasn't just about a parking dispute. It was the culmination of years of resentment. It was Sharon's checkmate. She couldn't beat him with her rules, so she'd resorted to brute force. She'd found his weak spot, the things he loved, and put a cage around them. This wasn't just an attack on my grandpa. It was an attack on our family, on our right to live peacefully in our own home. My world-weary side had seen people like Sharon before in different settings, in different jobs. Bullies who mistake fear for respect. People who get a little taste of power and let it consume them. They always think they're invincible. They always think the rules don't apply to them. And they always push things one step too far. As Sarah and I finally got Walter inside and sat him down with a glass of water, I looked out the window. The police car was gone, but the neighbors were still gathered in small, hushed groups, staring at the garage. They were looking at us, waiting to see what would happen next. Sharon had finally gone too far, and she'd done it in front of everyone. The battle lines were drawn. And as the first official payback from Sharon arrived in the mail the very next day, I knew this quiet suburban street was about to become a war zone. The first volley in Sharon's war of attrition arrived less than 24 hours after her driveway meltdown. It came in a crisp white envelope from the Westgate Meadows HOA, delivered by the mailman, but feeling more like a summons. My grandpa Walter opened it at his small kitchen table, his hands steady despite the tremor of anger I could see in his jaw. Inside were 5 separate violation notices. 5. Each one was more absurd than the last. The first was for improper vehicle storage, citing the 2 F-250s that she had put in his garage. The fine was $500. The second was for an unapproved garage door modification because he had dared to lock it. Another $250. The third, my personal favorite, was for creating a public nuisance, which was her description of the crowd that had gathered to watch her have a screaming fit in the middle of the street. The list went on, a masterpiece of petty fiction. The total came to $1,750. It was extortion, plain and simple. Sarah read them over my shoulder, her breath hissing out between her teeth. She can't be serious, she whispered. This is insane. Walter didn't say a word. He just neatly stacked the papers, slid them back into the envelope, and placed it on the counter, a little monument to Sharon's madness. But the letters were just the beginning. The real harassment started that night. At precisely 2:13 in the morning, our house was flooded with flashing red and blue lights. The piercing wail of sirens ripped through the quiet neighborhood. I shot out of bed, my heart pounding in my chest, convinced the house was on fire. I ran to the window and saw 2 police cars parked at odd angles in front of our house, their lights painting chaotic patterns on the walls of our bedroom. Sarah was right behind me. "What is happening?" she asked, her voice thick with sleep and fear. I saw Walter's light flick on in his apartment over the garage. Then, through the glare, I saw 2 officers approaching his door, their hands near their holsters. I didn't even bother with shoes. I flew down the stairs and burst out the front door, my bare feet hitting the cold, dew-soaked grass. "Hey, what's going on?" I yelled, trying to sound less panicked than I felt. One of the officers turned to me. He looked young and very tired. "Sir, We got a 911 call about a disturbance. The caller reported the sounds of a chainsaw and a woman screaming coming from this address. A chainsaw. My blood ran cold, then hot. I knew instantly who had made that call. It was so transparently malicious, so perfectly designed to terrify and intimidate an old man living alone. "Officer, my grandpa is 75 years old," I said, struggling to keep my voice even. "The only thing he's using at 2 in the morning is the bathroom. This is a false report. It's harassment." The officer held up a hand. "We have to check it out, sir." Protocol. They knocked on Walter's door. He opened it, dressed in his old flannel bathrobe, looking confused and frail in the flashing lights. They explained the call, and I saw the brief flicker of fear in his eyes before he masked it with his usual stoicism. They did a quick walkthrough of his apartment, their boots clamping on his clean floors, their flashlights probing the quiet corners of his life. Of course, they found nothing. No chainsaw, no screaming woman, just a quiet old man who had been woken from his sleep. They were polite, apologetic even. "Sorry to have bothered you, sir," the young officer said to Walter. "Looks like a prank call." But we all knew it wasn't a prank. It was a threat. A clear message from Sharon. "I can invade your home whenever I want. I can turn your safe space into a place of fear." As the police cars pulled away, the silence they left behind felt heavier, more menacing than the sirens had. Walter stood in his doorway for a long moment, then just nodded at Maya's silent, grim acknowledgement and closed his door. The final blow landed the next afternoon. It was an email sent from the official HOA account to every single resident in Westgate Meadows. The subject line was in all caps, "Urgent Community Security Alert." I opened it, my stomach tightening into a knot. It was a long, rambling message written in Sharon's signature style of self-important jargon and veiled threats. It painted a picture of a neighborhood under siege by a rogue element. It spoke of flagrant disregard for community standards, aggressive behavior toward board members, and potential for escalating conflict. It never used Walter's name, but it didn't have to. It described his property, his unauthorized workshop, and the recent incident involving law enforcement. It ended with a chilling sentence. "The board is taking all necessary steps to neutralize this threat and ensure the continued safety and security of our residents." She had just publicly declared my grandfather a man who once helped build the community park a menace. She was turning the entire neighborhood against him, using fear as her weapon. That was the breaking point for me, at least. I stormed over to Walter's apartment, the email still glowing on my phone screen. I found him in his workshop, or as close as he could get to it. He was standing by the back wall of the garage, staring at the taillights of the massive truck that blocked his sanctuary. He looked defeated. The fake fines, the terrifying midnight visit from the police, and now the public shaming it was a coordinated psychological assault, and it was working. All the fight seemed to have drained out of him. "This is it, Ethan," he said, his voice raspy. "She wins. Maybe I should just sell the Mustang. Get rid of the tools. It's not worth all this." Hearing those words from him was like a punch to the gut. Sharon wasn't just trying to win an argument. She was trying to break his spirit, and she was succeeding. My fiery temper, which Sarah was always trying to get me to control, flared up white hot. "No, not on my watch." "Like hell she wins," I said, my voice harder than I intended. "No, we're not giving in. We're not giving up. We're going to fight back." Walter looked at me, a flicker of his old self returning to his eyes. "How?" he asked. "She holds all the cards, son. She has the bylaws, the board, the lawyers." I shook my head. "She's a bully, Grandpa. And bullies always have a weakness. They build their little kingdoms on foundations of lies and fear." I looked from the trapped Mustang to the email on my phone. "We don't need to yell. We don't need to sink to her level. We just need proof. We need to find the truth she's hiding." Walter was silent for a moment. Then he gave a slow, deliberate nod. The decision was made. The gloves were off. Sharon Miller had started a war, but we were going to finish it. We just had to figure out how to find the ammunition we so desperately needed. The mission to find Sharon's weakness began with a simple, frustrating truth. She had built a fortress around herself. Every official channel was a dead end. When I sent a formal request to the HOA for the minutes of the last 3 board meetings, I received a reply from Sharon herself stating that the documents were under administrative review and unavailable. When I asked for a copy of the budget, I was told it would be presented at the annual meeting 6 months away. She was using the very rules she weaponized against us to shield herself. It was infuriating. It felt like trying to punch smoke. Every move I made was met with a bureaucratic brick wall. Meanwhile, the pressure mounted. Sharon's supporters on the board, a spineless duo named Gary and Brenda, took to driving slowly past our house, their glares a constant reminder that we were being watched. It was a siege, and we were losing. Sarah, ever the pragmatist, saw the futility of my direct approach. "You're playing her game, Ethan," she said one evening as I was fruitlessly scrolling through the HOA website for the 10th time. "You can't beat her with the rules because she's the one who writes them. You're trying to kick down the front door when there has to be a window left open somewhere." She was right. We needed a new strategy. We needed to find a person, not a document. A weak link in Sharon's chain of command. The HOA board consisted of 5 people. Sharon, her 2 loyal lapdogs, Gary and Brenda, and a quiet, nervous woman named Helen Cho, who served as the treasurer. The 5th spot had been vacant for a year because no one wanted to work with Sharon. Gary and Brenda were hopeless. They worshipped Sharon. That left Helen. I remembered her from the one HOA meeting I'd attended. She was a ghost. She sat at the end of the table, clutching a binder to her chest like a shield. She never spoke unless Sharon asked her a direct question, and even then, she would just whisper a yes or no, her eyes darting around the room as if she was afraid of being seen. She looked perpetually terrified. She was our open window. "Helen Cho," I said to Sarah, "the treasurer. She has to have access to the books." Sarah nodded slowly. "But she looks like she'd faint if you said boo to her. How are we going to get her to talk?" "Sharon probably has her completely terrorized." That's where neighbor Arthur came in. Arthur, with his porch-side surveillance and encyclopedic knowledge of neighborhood gossip, was our unofficial intelligence agency. I caught him the next day while he was meticulously trimming his hedges with a pair of tiny scissors. "Arthur," I said, leaning on the fence, "tell me about Helen Cho." Arthur snipped a leaf, examined his work, and then looked at me over the top of his glasses. "Helen, poor woman. A mouse in a snake pit," he said. "Moved here about 7 years ago. Husband left her for his yoga instructor. Sharon sort of adopted her, took her under her wing." He paused, a thoughtful look on his face. "Funny thing is, Helen used to be a firecracker, coached her kids' soccer team, organized the block party. Then her husband left, and Sharon swooped in. Ever since, she's been a shadow." Arthur then provided the key piece of information. "I know she volunteers at the animal shelter every Saturday morning. It's the only time I ever see her smile." He then told me a story about how Sharon had tried to get the shelter shut down because of excessive barking, but Helen had organized a petition and a fundraiser that saved it. It was a tiny crack in the terrified facade. Helen Cho had a spine. It was just buried under years of Sharon's bullying. The plan was delicate. I was too hot-headed for this kind of mission. My righteous anger would scare her off in a second. This was a job for Sarah. Her calm, empathetic nature was our only shot. We decided Sarah would accidentally run into Helen at the animal shelter. We spent the next few days strategizing. It felt like planning a covert operation. We knew we only had one chance. If we spooked her, that window would slam shut forever. The tension in our house was thick enough to cut with a knife. Every time a car with an HOA parking sticker drove by, I felt a jolt of adrenaline. Were we being watched? Did Sharon suspect something? My grandpa Walter grew quieter, spending more time in his apartment. I could see the toll this was taking on him. He was trying to be strong for us, but the constant anxiety was wearing him down. This wasn't just about getting revenge anymore. It was about getting my grandpa's life back. It was about restoring his peace and quiet. The Saturday of the operation arrived. I drove Sarah to the shelter and waited in the car down the street, my stomach churning with nerves. I felt completely helpless, just waiting for a text. An hour went by, then another. I was starting to think it was a bust. Maybe Helen hadn't shown up. Maybe she'd seen Sarah and run. My mind raced with failure. I was about to give up and go in when my phone buzzed. It was a text from Sarah, on my way out. It didn't work. My heart sank. Failure. I started the car, a bitter taste in my mouth. We had put all our hopes on this one desperate plan, and it had failed. Sarah got in the car, her face grim. She was terrified, Sarah said, her voice full of disappointment. The moment I mentioned the HOA, she clammed up. She just kept shaking her head and saying, "I can't. You don't understand what she'll do." I tried, Ethan. I really did. But she's too scared. We drove home in silence, the weight of our defeat pressing down on us. It felt like the end of the road. Sharon had won. She had insulated herself so perfectly, building her walls with other people's fear. We were out of options, out of ideas, and out of time. As we pulled into our driveway, I felt a profound sense of despair. How could we possibly fight a monster who had this much control? That evening, the mood in our house was bleak. We ate dinner in near silence, the clinking of our forks the only sound. Walter had joined us, but he just pushed his food around his plate. The hope that had briefly flickered over the past few days was gone, replaced by a heavy sense of resignation. Sarah and I tried to talk about other things: work, a movie we wanted to see, but the conversation felt hollow. The unspoken truth hung in the air: we had lost. Sharon Miller had beaten us. After dinner, I was rinsing dishes in the sink, staring out the window into the dark backyard, when Sarah gasped, "Ethan, what is that?" I turned. She was pointing at our back door. There on the doormat was a small, plain manila envelope. It hadn't been there a few minutes ago. My heart started to pound. I cautiously opened the door and picked it up. It was thin, and there was no name on it. I brought it inside, my hands trembling slightly. Was this another threat from Sharon? A new violation notice delivered under the cover of darkness? I opened the flap and tipped the contents onto the kitchen table. It wasn't a letter. It was a USB flash drive, a simple black plastic rectangle. Tucked inside the envelope was a small, folded piece of paper. I unfolded it. On it, in shaky, hurried handwriting, were 5 words. "She ruined my life, too." My mind reeled. Who could have left this? My first thought was another of Sharon's victims, a neighbor who was too afraid to come forward publicly. But then it clicked. The shaky handwriting, the desperation. This had to be from Helen Cho. Our conversation at the animal shelter hadn't been a failure after all. We hadn't scared her off. We had given her a lifeline. We had shown her that someone was willing to fight. And it had sparked that little bit of fire Arthur had told me about. She was still too terrified to talk to us directly, but she had found another way to help. She had given us the key. "Sarah, get the laptop," I said, my voice barely a whisper. The despair that had been choking me for hours was replaced by a jolt of pure adrenaline. This was it. This was the chink in the armor. Sarah hurried back with her laptop, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and excitement. I plugged the drive in. My hands were sweating. For a moment, I was worried it might be a trick, a virus that would wipe our computer, sent by Sharon to punish us for snooping. But what choice did we have? I clicked on the drive. A single folder appeared on the screen labeled HOA_finance. I clicked again. The folder opened to reveal a treasure trove of documents, scanned bank statements, budgets, expense reports, and dozens of files, all meticulously organized by year, going back 7 years. It was the entire financial history of the Westgate Meadows Homeowners Association. It was everything Sharon had tried so hard to keep hidden. She had given us the whole kingdom. We started opening files at random, and the picture quickly became clear. For the first few years, things looked normal: landscaping costs, pool maintenance, insurance payments. But then, about 4 years ago, a new expense started appearing. A monthly payment, always for the same amount, $1,000, to a company called Miller Consulting Services. Miller, Sharon's last name. It was right there in black and white. $1,000 every single month for 4 years. Then, 3 years ago, the payment started to increase. $1,200 a month, then $1,500. "Do the math," Sarah said, her voice tight. I pulled out my phone and started punching in the numbers. The total was staggering. It was over $90,000. $90,000 of our neighbors' money paid directly into a company that shared a name with our HOA president. "It has to be a shell company," I said, a grim satisfaction spreading through me. "She's been bleeding this community dry for years, right under our noses." This was the twist I never saw coming. I had expected to find evidence of her misusing funds for personal luxuries, a fancy trip, expensive dinners, but this was so much bigger. This was methodical, long-term embezzlement. This was a criminal enterprise hiding in plain sight. Helen Cho hadn't just given us a weapon. She had given us a nuke. The timid treasurer, the woman we had written off as too scared to help, had been our secret weapon all along. She had been watching, documenting, and waiting for someone, anyone, to stand up to Sharon. We finally had the proof we needed. Hard, undeniable evidence of her corruption. The game had completely changed. We were no longer on the defensive. We were on the attack. The question now was no longer how to survive Sharon's assault, but how to launch our own. We held her future in our hands on a tiny piece of black plastic. And as I looked at the glowing screen, a dozen different plans for revenge started to form in my mind. The flash drive sat on the kitchen table between us, a small black rectangle holding enough dynamite to blow Sharon Miller's world apart. My first instinct was primal and immediate. I wanted to take it straight to the police. I pictured Officer Ramos slapping handcuffs on her, the satisfying click of the metal, the look of shock and outrage on Sharon's face as she was led away from her perfect white Lexus. I wanted justice, and I wanted it now. My fiery nature was screaming for retribution. This woman had terrorized my grandfather, threatened my family, and stolen from our neighbors. The core question that had been echoing in my mind, how far will a man go to defend his own, felt simple in that moment. I would go all the way. I would burn her whole kingdom to the ground. I'm calling Ramos, I said, reaching for my phone. Let's end this tonight. But Sarah put her hand on my arm, stopping me. Her expression was thoughtful. Wait, Ethan, she said calmly. Think about this. If we go to the police right now, it becomes a legal battle. It'll be slow. There will be lawyers, delays, motions. Sharon will paint herself as the victim. She'll say it's all a misunderstanding, a bookkeeping error. She'll try to drag us through the mud. She was right. The initial satisfaction of her arrest would quickly fade into a long, drawn-out war of attrition in a courtroom, and Sharon had the money our money to hire good lawyers. Then Walter, who had been listening from the doorway, spoke up. His voice was quiet but firm, the weariness replaced by a cold resolve. Your wife is right, son, he said, walking over to the table. He picked up the flash drive and looked at it. Getting her arrested is only half the battle. That's justice for us. But what about everyone else in this neighborhood? What about Arthur and his mailbox? What about the Hendersons and their beige house? She didn't just steal from them. She humiliated them. She made them feel small and powerless in their own homes. He looked at me, his eyes clear and intense. If we just have her arrested, she becomes a criminal. But if we expose her in front of everyone, she becomes a fool. We need to take away her power first. The power she holds over everyone here. We need to show them who she really is and let them be the ones to cast her out. It was a moral crossroads. My gut screamed for immediate, personal revenge. I wanted to be the one to bring her down. But Walter and Sarah were arguing for a different kind of justice, a public reckoning. A trial not in a courtroom, but in the court of public opinion, right here in the community she had terrorized. It was a choice between my own satisfaction and a victory for the entire neighborhood. It was the difference between a private win and a public liberation. My world-weary side knew they were right. I'd seen what happened when you cornered powerful people quietly. They had ways of slipping through the cracks. But public humiliation, that was a stain that never washed out. Okay, I said, taking a deep breath and letting the fire in my chest cool to a controlled burn. Okay, you're right. We do it your way. We don't just get her arrested. We get her erased. A slow smile spread across Sarah's face. Walter gave a single, satisfied nod. The decision was made. We would lay a trap, and we would use Sharon's own arrogance as the bait. For the next hour, we huddled around the kitchen table, a council of war planning the perfect counterattack. We needed a stage, a captive audience, and a moment of maximum impact. We couldn't just send out a mass email like she did. That was her move. We needed something more dramatic, more theatrical. And then, as if on cue, my phone buzzed with an incoming email. It was from the HOA. My blood pressure spiked for a second before I read the subject line. I started to laugh. I couldn't help it. It was too perfect. Sharon, in her infinite hubris, had just handed us the gun and pointed it at her own head. You are not going to believe this, I said, turning the phone around for Sarah and Walter to see. It was an invitation to a special emergency HOA meeting. The subject, addressing the escalating security crisis in Westgate Meadows. The agenda she had laid out was clear. She was going to use this meeting to publicly brand my grandfather a menace and push for a vote to have him legally sanctioned, maybe even force him to sell his tools or his car. She was planning to use the community as a weapon to finish the job. She was calling a meeting to publicly execute my grandpa's good name. She's giving us the stage, Sarah whispered, her eyes gleaming. She's gathering the entire neighborhood in one room for us. The plan came together in a flash. It was simple, elegant, and brutal. Sharon would be expecting a presentation on security. She would be expecting to control the narrative. We would give her a presentation, all right, just not the one she was expecting. I would handle the technical side. I would volunteer to run the projector for the meeting, citing a desire to be a more involved member of the community. She would be so blinded by her own ego, so sure of her victory, that she wouldn't see the Trojan horse right in front of her. The trap was set. The moral debate was over. We had chosen our path, not the swift, easy path of personal revenge, but the harder, more satisfying path of public justice. As I looked at the determined faces of my wife and my grandfather, I knew we had made the right choice. Sharon Miller was about to host a meeting about her own downfall. She just didn't know it yet. The only question left was whether our plan would actually work. The night of the meeting, the community center was buzzing with a nervous energy. It was the biggest turnout for an HOA meeting I'd ever seen. Usually, you were lucky to get 10 people. Tonight, the room was packed. There were at least 50 residents crammed into the stuffy space, their faces a mixture of curiosity, anger, and fear. Sharon had successfully whipped the neighborhood into a frenzy, but it was a double-edged sword. She had their attention, but she also had their scrutiny. I was at the front of the room, fiddling with the cables connecting my laptop to the old, clunky projector. I had approached Sharon earlier in the week, offering my technical assistance with a sickeningly sweet smile. "I just want to help make sure your presentation goes smoothly, Sharon," I'd said. "It sounds really important." She had eaten it up, patting my arm condescendingly. "It's so nice to see some of the younger generation finally taking an interest," she'd said, completely oblivious. It took every ounce of my self-control not to smirk. Sarah and Walter sat in the third row. Walter looked calm, almost serene. He had the quiet confidence of a man who knew the deck was stacked in his favor. Sarah caught my eye and gave me a subtle, encouraging nod. In the back of the room, I spotted neighbor Arthur leaning against the wall with his arms crossed. He gave me a slow, almost imperceptible wink. He didn't know the details of our plan, but he knew something was about to happen. He had a look on his face like a man who had bought a front-row ticket to the circus. The air was thick with anticipation. Finally, Sharon strode to the podium at the front of the room, basking in the attention. She tapped the microphone, sending a piercing squeal through the speakers. "Thank you all for coming," she began, her voice dripping with false sincerity. "It pains me that we have to meet under such dire circumstances." She launched into her speech, a masterfully woven tapestry of lies and exaggerations. She spoke of eroding community values and unacceptable security risks. She painted a picture of a neighborhood on the brink of chaos, all because of one person who refused to follow the rules. She never used Walter's name, but she gestured vaguely in our direction several times, letting the crowd fill in the blanks. I could feel the mood in the room shifting. Some people were nodding along, buying into her fear-mongering. Others were whispering to each other, looking uncomfortable. This was the moment. Sharon paused for dramatic effect. "To illustrate the severity of the situation," she announced, "I have prepared a short presentation." She turned to me, a smug smile on her face. "Ethan, if you would." She held out a USB drive. This was the critical moment, the sleight of hand. I took her drive with my left hand, my movements calm and deliberate. As I turned my body toward the laptop, my right hand, which was already holding our identical-looking drive, came up. In one smooth motion, hidden from her view by the laptop screen, I plugged our drive into the USB port. I placed her drive on the table beside me. It took less than a second. My heart was hammering against my ribs, but my hands were steady. "Ready when you are, Sharon," I said, my voice surprisingly even. "Dim the lights, please, Gary," she commanded. Her loyal crony scurried to the light switch, and the room went dark, save for the bright white rectangle of light projected onto the screen behind her. "Now," she said, her voice echoing in the quiet room, "let's take a look at the evidence." She clicked the remote she was holding. But instead of a picture of my grandpa's unapproved workshop, the first slide that appeared on the screen was a scanned copy of a bank statement from the Westgate Meadows HOA. A collective gasp rippled through the room. Sharon froze. She stared at the screen, her mouth slightly open. She clicked the remote again, frantically this time. The next slide appeared, a detailed transaction history. And the next, a close-up of a recurring payment. And there it was for all to see, glowing 10 feet high on the wall. Payee, Miller Consulting Services. "What is this?" someone from the crowd yelled. Sharon fumbled with the remote, her face a mask of pure panic. This is a technical difficulty," she stammered. "Ethan, what have you done?" But I just sat there, my face a perfect picture of innocence. "I just put in the drive you gave me, Sharon," I said loudly for everyone to hear. Sarah stood up. "I think you should keep going, Sharon," she said, her voice ringing with clarity and strength. "This presentation is very illuminating." I took over, clicking through the slides from my laptop. A summary page showing the total payments over $90,000. A corporate filing document for Miller Consulting Services listing the sole proprietor, Sharon Miller. The evidence was irrefutable, laid out for everyone. The initial gasps in the room turned into a low, angry murmur. People were standing up, pointing at the screen, then at Sharon. The tide had turned instantly and violently. "This is a lie. A fabrication," Sharon shrieked, but her voice was drowned out by the rising anger of the crowd. "She's been stealing from us," someone shouted. "All those fines she was paying herself," another added. Neighbor Arthur's voice cut through the chaos. "I move for an immediate vote of no confidence," he yelled, "and a full independent audit of the financials." The room erupted in a chorus of ayes, and seconded. Gary and Brenda, Sharon's loyalists, looked pale and horrified. They were sinking with their captain. It happened faster than I could have imagined. Within 5 minutes, an impromptu vote was held. The result was nearly unanimous. Only Sharon and a proxy ballot from her absent nephew voted no. Even Gary and Brenda couldn't bring themselves to oppose the motion. Sharon Miller was suspended as president, effective immediately. A special election was to be scheduled. Her reign was over. She stood at the podium, trembling with rage, her face pale. The crowd was jeering at her. She had walked in as a queen and was leaving as a pariah. She threw the remote down on the table, where it clattered and broke. She gave me, Sarah, and Walter a look of pure, undiluted hatred. It was a look that promised this was far from over. Then she turned and stormed out of the room, slamming the door behind her. We had won. We had done it. We had exposed her and taken away her power. A wave of relief and triumph washed over me. But as I watched the door swing shut behind her, a small, cold knot of unease formed in my stomach. A cornered animal is a dangerous one. We had humiliated her, but we hadn't neutralized her. And I had a terrible feeling that Sharon Miller's final act of vengeance was yet to come. The aftermath of the meeting was euphoric. Our house became the unofficial headquarters for the revolution. Neighbors we had barely spoken to before were stopping by, shaking my hand, and clapping Walter on the back. They brought cakes and casseroles, offerings of gratitude. The fear that had gripped Westgate Meadows for years had shattered in a single night. People were laughing in their front yards again. Someone put up a string of brightly colored, unapproved party lights, and everyone cheered. Neighbor Arthur was leading the charge to form an interim committee, his face beaming with a newfound sense of purpose. "We're taking our neighborhood back, Ethan," he said, pumping my hand vigorously. "No more beige tyranny." For the first time in a long time, it felt like home again. We had done it. We had cut the head off the snake. We celebrated that night, the three of us. We ordered pizzas and opened a bottle of champagne that had been gathering dust in our cabinet. Walter was a different man. The weight of the world seemed to have lifted from his shoulders. He was smiling, telling old stories, his eyes twinkling with the same fire I remembered from my childhood. He even talked about finally getting the Mustang out for a long drive up the coast. The victory felt complete, absolute. We were so caught up in the celebration, so sure we had won, that we never saw the second twist coming. The call came the next morning. It was Helen Cho. Her voice was thin and shaky, on the verge of tears. "Ethan, it's gone," she whispered, her voice cracking. "It's all gone." My blood went cold. The triumphant feeling from the night before evaporated instantly. "What's gone, Helen? What are you talking about?" I asked, my voice tight with dread. "The money," she choked out. "The HOA reserve account. All of it. I went to the bank this morning to start the audit process with Arthur, and they told me. The account was closed out yesterday afternoon. A wire transfer for the full amount." I felt my stomach plummet. "How much, Helen?" I asked, already knowing the answer would be bad. "How much was in the account?" There was a pause, and I could hear her take a ragged breath. $154,000, she said. "She took everything. And she's gone." I hung up the phone, stunned into silence. Sarah saw the look on my face. "What is it? What's wrong?" I couldn't speak for a moment. I just stood there in the kitchen, the morning sun streaming in, feeling like a fool. We hadn't won. We had just been a distraction. Our big public takedown, the triumphant meeting, the vote was all a smokescreen. While we were celebrating, patting ourselves on the back, Sharon was executing the final phase of her real plan. The $90,000 we had found the embezzlement through her consulting firm, that wasn't the main crime. That was just her petty cash fund. The real heist was the entire community's savings. And she had used our attack as the perfect cover. She knew we were coming for her. The moment Helen refused to talk to Sarah at the animal shelter, Sharon must have known the clock was ticking. She had probably started planning her exit then. Our public ambush didn't corner her. It just gave her the exact timeline she needed. While all eyes were on her public humiliation, She was quietly, electronically looting the entire treasury. The realization hit me like a physical blow. We hadn't cut the head off the snake. We had just pissed it off and let it escape into the tall grass, but not before it delivered one last, fatal bite. She had played us. She had used our own righteous anger, our desire for public justice, against us. She let us have our little victory, knowing it would keep us occupied while she got away with the real prize. The sense of triumph curdled into a bitter, sickening feeling of failure. I had to tell Walter. I walked over to his apartment, my feet feeling like lead. He was in the garage, staring at the two trucks that were still wedged inside. He was humming to himself, looking happier than I'd seen him in years. "Morning, Ethan," he said cheerfully. "I was just thinking, once we get these monstrosities out of here, you and I should take the Mustang for a spin." My heart broke. I had to wipe the smile right off his face. "Grandpa," I said, my voice low, "we need to talk." I told him everything about Helen's call, the empty bank account, the $154,000. I watched as the light faded from his eyes, the joy draining from his face to be replaced by that familiar, weary resignation. He sank down onto a nearby stool, looking older than he had the day before. "So she won after all," he said, his voice flat. "She got the last laugh." The shame I felt was immense. My plan, my big, clever idea to humiliate her publicly, had enabled this. If I had just listened to my own gut instinct and gone to the police in the first place, she might have been in custody before she could make that transfer. My attempt at a more satisfying, community-based justice had cost the community its entire life savings. The weight of that failure was crushing. "No," I said, my voice hardening. The shame was turning back into anger, but this time it was a cold, focused rage. "No, she does not get the last laugh. This isn't over." Walter looked up at me, his expression doubtful. "What can we do, son? She's gone. Vanished. She could be anywhere by now." I shook my head, my mind already racing, shifting gears from public strategist to something else, something older and more determined. "People like her don't just vanish," I said. "They're arrogant. They make mistakes. They leave trails. She thinks she's free and clear. She thinks she's won. That's when she'll get sloppy." My world-weary sighed. The part of me that had seen the worst in people before was taking over. This was no longer about bylaws or community meetings. This had become a hunt. I looked at the massive truck still imprisoning my grandpa's history, at the defeated look on his face. And I made a silent promise. I would find her. I would get that money back. The battle for Westgate Meadows wasn't over. It had just gone from a public war to a private one. And this time, I wasn't going to make the same mistake twice. There would be no more public spectacles. There would just be a reckoning. The hunt for Sharon Miller began in the quiet of my home office, long after Sarah and Walter had gone to bed. The initial shock had worn off, replaced by a cold, methodical fury. I wasn't the hot-headed kid anymore. That part of me had been burned away by our catastrophic victory. This was different. This was a job. My first call was to Officer Ramos. I explained the situation, the emptied bank account, Sharon's disappearance. She was professional, but I could hear the frustration in her voice. She promised to put out a BOLO bay on the lookout and file the necessary reports, but she was blunt. "Honestly, Ethan, with a wire transfer, she could be anywhere. She's got a 12-hour head start. Don't get your hopes up." I knew she was right from a police perspective. They had protocols, procedures. I didn't. I had a personal stake in this, which meant I wasn't bound by the same rules. People like Sharon, consumed by their own ego, always leave breadcrumbs. They want to flaunt their victory, even if it's just to themselves. I started digging. My day job was in IT security, a fact I rarely mentioned. I spent my days building digital walls for corporations. Now, I was going to spend my night tearing one down. I started with the obvious, her digital footprint. She was arrogant enough to think she'd covered her tracks, but nobody ever covers everything. I found traces of her online life, fragments she'd forgotten to erase, an old social media profile she hadn't used in years but hadn't deleted. It was mostly pictures of her Lexus and complaints about bad service at restaurants. But buried deep in her friends list was a name that caught my eye, a cousin in Arizona. While I was working the digital angle, Sarah, unable to sleep, was working the human one. She dived into the social media profiles of Sharon's few known relatives, looking for clues. It was a long shot, but we were desperate. For hours, we worked in silence. The only sounds the clicking of keys and the quiet hum of the computer. The trail was cold. It felt like she had truly vanished. Then, around 3 a.m., Sarah made a breakthrough. Ethan, look at this. She pointed to her screen. It was a post from Sharon's cousin, a picture of a desert landscape, a cabin nestled among some rocks. The caption read, "Enjoying the quiet life at the old family place. So peaceful up here." The post was from 2 days ago. It could be a coincidence, but my gut told me it wasn't. The final piece of the puzzle came from the most unlikely source, neighbor Arthur. I called him early the next morning, my voice low. "Arthur, I need you to think. Did Sharon ever talk about getting away, a vacation spot, anything?" Arthur was quiet for a long moment. "The dragon lady, she never talked about vacations, only violations," he said. Then he paused. "Wait a minute. There was this one time a few months back. I was on my porch. She was yelling at the mailman about leaving tracks on her lawn, and she said something weird. She said, 'I wish I was at the cabin. No people, no idiots, just peace and quiet.' I asked her what cabin. She got this nasty look on her face and said it was none of my business. But she mentioned it was someplace her ex-husband got stuck with in the divorce, out in the middle of nowhere. A cabin. Her ex-husband. The cousin's post. The pieces were clicking into place. I did a quick property search for her ex-husband's name in Arizona, and there it was. A small, remote property about 200 miles away, surrounded by acres of government land. A perfect place to disappear. This was the point of no return. I couldn't go to the police with this. It was circumstantial, I guess. They wouldn't send a team out based on a social media post and a piece of gossip. If I was wrong, I was just a guy on a wild goose chase. But if I was right, I had to go myself. "I'm going," I told Sarah. She looked at me, her eyes full of worry. "Alone? Ethan, that's dangerous. What if she's there? What will you do?" "I'm not going to be a hero," I said, my voice grim. "I'm going to be a scout. I'll find the cabin, confirm she's there, and then I'll call Ramos with a confirmed location. No heroics, just confirmation." I could tell she didn't believe me, but she also knew she couldn't stop me. I packed a small bag, kissed her goodbye, and told Walter I was going on a short business trip. I couldn't bear to give him another dose of false hope. The drive was long and silent, just me, the road, and my thoughts. I was running on pure adrenaline and caffeine. As I got closer, the landscape became more desolate, the roads narrower and dustier. This was the middle of nowhere. I finally found the dirt track that led to the property and parked my car a half-mile away, hidden in a cluster of rocks. I walked the rest of the way, my heart pounding with every step. The cabin came into view. It was small, isolated, and parked right next to it, partially hidden by a tarp, was a white Lexus SUV. She was here. I crept closer, using the sparse vegetation for cover. I circled around to a dirty window at the back of the cabin. I peered inside, and there she was, Sharon Miller. The room was a mess of open suitcases and bags, and piled on the table in messy stacks was cash. Tens of thousands of dollars in cash. She was packing to run again, converting the stolen money into a more portable form. I had her. I pulled back from the window, my mind racing. I had my phone in my hand, my thumb hovering over Ramos's number. Just confirm she's there. That was the plan. But then I saw something else on the table next to the piles of money. A stack of official-looking documents. Even from a distance, I could recognize the letterhead. It was from the bank, and resting on top of them was my grandpa's name. A cold dread washed over me. She wasn't just running. She was planning to frame him. She had probably forged documents to make it look like he had initiated the transfer. A final, vicious act of revenge. My anger, which I had kept so carefully controlled, exploded. The plan went out the window. This was no longer just about the money. This was about my family. I wasn't waiting for the police. I walked to the front of the cabin, my footsteps loud in the silence. I kicked the door open. It flew off its rusty hinges and crashed to the floor. Sharon spun around, eyes wide with disbelief. "You," she gasped, frozen between piles of stolen cash. I stood in the doorway, blocking her only exit. "It's over," I said. She tried to bluff, claimed she was just on vacation, but the evidence on the table said otherwise. "Let's make a deal," she offered, all sugar and poison. "You can have half." I laughed. That ship has sailed. Then, gravel crunched outside. A car door slammed. Her face fell. I'd sent my location to Officer Ramos before kicking the door in. Moments later, Ramos entered with local deputies. "Sharon Miller, you're under arrest." No screaming, no fight, just the cold click of cuffs. Her empire of embezzlement and fake fines collapsed. Every stolen dollar was returned. Back home, Helen Cho was elected HOA president. She and Arthur shredded Sharon's petty rules, starting with the one about beige curtains. And when Walter's Mustang finally roared back to life, it wasn't just an engine starting. It was a neighborhood waking up. That night, the three of us sat on the porch in peace.